Today is July 10th, 2022. It is, I believe, the fifth Sunday following Pentecost, and it is proper 10. The propers are the readings for ordinary time. Ordinary time is in the season of Pentecost, which is in the summer and fall, and in the season of Epiphany, which is in the spring. And they adjust depending on when Easter is. You either have more or less propers in Epiphany, and you have less or more in Pentecost. But the vast majority of them are in Pentecost. And we're in proper 10 in the fifth week of Pentecost because, 5 of them were during the season of Epiphany. Just little church arcana for those of you who don't quite understand what a proper is. It's generally a collect, a prayer, and an old Hebrew scripture reading, and a psalm, and it's also one of Paul's letters usually, and then the gospel reading. In this case, the gospel reading is the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a story that everybody has heard one way or another now and again, and it's about how the priest and the Levi pass by on the other side. These are religious leaders. They do not love their neighbor as their self. That's how the story is told, anyway. And the despised one, the Samaritan, actually stops and does his duty by the man. And I say duty because the law, the summary of the law, love your God and love your neighbor, those are the two laws that Jesus pointed out were important, and he loved his neighbor, though it was not expected of him. It was expected of the priest and the Levite, but they didn't do it because their values were not exactly in tune with where Jesus was coming from. Judaism at the time, it is no longer, but at the time was oriented toward purity. There are groups within Judaism that are still oriented toward purity, but mostly they're not. Mostly they're have a fuller understanding of loving God and neighbor. But the point is that the priest and the Levite, if either of them had stopped, they would have had to then go back to Jerusalem and be purified, because that's where they'd been. They'd been in Jerusalem doing their duty to the temple, and they had been purified in that process, and so they were pure, and they were going back to their hometown, and they were going to be impure because of touching a body with blood. The Samaritan had no such misgivings. If he did, he overcame them in order to take care of the fellow. Now, this is a famous story. It's a well-told story. It's a story that's well worth repeating, and it's incredibly how it hits us in the solar plexus and says, whoa. Yes, this story will last, still is powerful, and still shames us, as it should, reminding us that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. I've been thinking about that. To love our neighbor as ourself. So that implies, first of all, that we love ourselves, and second of all, that we love our neighbor as much as we love ourselves. That's a lot when you think about it. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that the Good Samaritan really just it kind of spits in our soup. If we've got this little concern and that little concern, and Jesus said, here's a problem, take care of it. I remember when we had a great flood in Kansas City, and there were droves of Mennonites from western Kansas who came in, and they were organized. They were organized to do rescue operations, rescue and recovery. I mean, they went into people's houses that had been flooded, and they helped muck out the mess, and they did all kinds of things to help people out. And they were farmers, so they were wheat farmers, and so they could leave their crops to grow while they were there, and they could be there for 4, 6, 8 weeks, depending on when the disaster happened. I met a bunch of them because our congregation provided space for them to stay in, so they didn't have to rent space somewhere. They were staying in the school dormitories of the school. It was summer, so there was no problem with that. But a great effort was made. They were reading the Good Samaritan quite literally, and I met numbers of people who were very grateful for their ministrations. We're in an odd moment. Individualism has kind of gone wild, and tribalism as well, and so we're sort of separated into these narcissistic tribes that are taking care of themselves more than they're taking care of the people. They speak in populist tones, but they really aren't doing a whole lot. The art of politics is redirection. In other words, if you're upset about this, they put your attention over here, so you don't, you forget about that. And people do. It's just the way of the world and the way of politicians. But government, after all, is important. We get a lot. We're stuck between two ideologies. One that thinks that government should be minimal, and the other that thinks that government should be maximal. The Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. The problem with minimal is you just might as well wipe out the middle class, because the middle class requires a government that is more maximal than government creates boundaries for business. And business kicks up against those boundaries, but the fact is they need those boundaries in order for commerce to really go forward. And all of you who fly in airplanes, I say all of you because I find the experience of flying about as disgusting as taking a cross-country bus back 40 years ago. It was all jammed in, and it's about as unpleasant as it can be. It's short term, but of course then you have to take your clothes off to get in the plane, and so on and so forth. It's just not a very pleasant experience, so I don't do it. But those of you who do it require, whether you realize it or not, air traffic controllers. Now, if they don't do their job right, your plane crashes or it runs into another plane or some horrible thing happens. But they do their job, and they are government workers. So you need the government to do some kinds of services, and air traffic control is just one of them. There are a lot of other services that should be done by the government as well. When I lived in Wyoming, I remember meeting droves of people who thought the only thing that the government should do is have a standing army and support agriculture. Well, yeah, okay, that's kind of a narcissistic tribal approach to government. Yeah, I've got a ranch. I want my ranch to prosper. So yes, let's have the subsidies, but let's not do all that other stuff. I mean, who needs it? If we're going to have a small government, at least have agriculture and military. Well, whether you like it or not, the 1930s blew away the idea of a small government because the middle class, what little middle class there was at the time, would have been destroyed, and it provided a way, actually, right through the 50s and 60s, for the middle class to prosper. In the 70s, the corporate America took over and got rid of the unions and deflected, as they had done, people against their own self-interest, and so corporations took over. They took over the regulatory things by putting people in who were going to come into their business and giving them breaks that they wouldn't have gotten ordinarily if the regulatory people were actually doing their job. Now, I'm not suggesting the regulatory people don't do their job. I'm just suggesting that corporations have co-opted pretty much everything, including now the Supreme Court. So loving your neighbor as yourself. In a mass society, you pretty much have to have the government being the one that takes care of things. And it's a hard thing to do because you have a whole bunch of people who think the government shouldn't do that, and you have a whole bunch of people who think it should, and then you have a whole bigger bunch that don't care one way or the other. Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how can we do that? Well, certainly we can vote. Certainly we stop and care for those people who are distressed. Or at least call an ambulance or whatever we can do to help. The Good Samaritan. It's Jesus' story answer to the question about what are the most important laws. The most important laws are to love God with heart, body, mind, and soul, and love our neighbor as ourself, which means you have to love yourself, but you have to love your neighbor as much, which means the narcissism thing doesn't really work, nor does the tribal thing work, because the Samaritan was not in the tribe. Well, great story. Have a good day. Have a good week.